All right, so we'll get started in our second session. Did you know that a Baptist pastor is largely responsible for the First Amendment? I recently came across a story of an individual named John Leland. He was a pastor in Virginia. If you remember, Virginia had a state church, and you had to have basically a license to preach. And last time I checked, the Bible is my license to preach, right? Amen. And so he worked actually with Jefferson and Madison to deregulate, to deestablish the state church in the state of Virginia. So he did that. He then also moved to Massachusetts and was working on deestablishing the state church there as well. So he's a big fan of religious liberty. He also helped, again, with the First Amendment, because if you remember, the Constitution was passed or was written by the Constitutional Convention, but then it had to be ratified. James Madison, who is largely considered the architect of the Constitution, he's the guy that drafts most of it, he was actually less popular than Leland was in what's called Orange County, Virginia. And so Madison was concerned that Pastor Leland would go to the ratifying convention instead of him for the document he drafted. So they met, and I would have loved to have been, a flyer, something like right there. And they met in this orchard. You can go visit this spot. And they had this conversation. And essentially, Leland told Madison, hey, you can have my spot, but you have to guarantee me something. You have to guarantee religious liberty. You have to guarantee the First Amendment. And so Madison kept his word. Madison took the spot. Constitution is ratified. And then right away, Madison began working. It says that he hounded his colleagues, essentially, to get the First Amendment passed. So if you're grateful for free speech, you're grateful for freedom of religion, you can thank a Baptist pastor. Now, the story doesn't end there, because Leland, he had a flair for the dramatic. Okay, so I mentioned he moved to Massachusetts. Well, Thomas Jefferson was a good friend of his. They had worked together in Virginia. So when Jefferson became president, Leland, he gathered a bunch of cows, and they created a 1,235-pound wheel of cheese. All right, it was 13 feet wide. It was 4 feet tall. It had a red crust. And in the crust was inscribed one of Jefferson's favorite sayings, like disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing says America like a giant, tyrant-defying wheel of cheese, okay? So he makes this cheese, and he takes it in the dead of winter from Massachusetts all the way to Washington, D.C. Now, he also used it as a sermon prop. He was first and foremost a church planter. And so everywhere he goes, and so it was called the Mammoth Cheese. There's actually this fantastic poem called the Ode to the Mammoth Cheese, okay? And so he writes it, there's this great line, oh, may no enemy to this country's cause e'er have a piece of thee between his jaws. That's beautiful poetry right there. All right, so he delivers it to Thomas Jefferson, and reportedly Thomas Jefferson's like, thanks? What do you do with the giant wheel of cheese? I don't know. But he gives him this wheel of cheese. Now, it may be just a little bit difficult to see, but if you can see down there, what is the date on this poem? It's January 1st, 1802. And Jefferson, this is the day that the giant wheel of cheese gets delivered, all right, January 1st. So I was studying something recently, and I noticed a particular date. And if you remember, there's a famous letter by Thomas Jefferson to a group called the Danbury Baptists. And the Danbury Baptists would be like a group of Baptist churches in Texas that are concerned about religious freedom, advocating at the State House. So it's this association of Baptist churches. So he sends this letter. It's been famously misconstrued, separation of church and state, a wall of separation. But the letter is actually a great letter. It's saying that, look, government is not going to interfere in the church. That's basically what it says. We're going to give you religious freedom in this new nation, in this new republic. So he's addressing those concerns. So look at the date. And again, it might be a little hard to see, but this is a copy of that letter. Guess when Jefferson wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptist? January 1, 1802. So why was religious freedom on Jefferson's mind? Now, we don't know the exact sequence of the day, but why was religious liberty on Jefferson's mind on January 1st? Well, probably because his good friend had just delivered him a massive, tyrant-defying wheel of cheese on that same day. And what I love about this story is it shows that from the beginning of our republic, there have been Christians in public life that have encouraged religious freedom, that have stood up for it, that have built even personal relationships with those in authority to say this is something we should value. And so it just jumped out at me that it's literally the same day he delivers the cheese, and then Jefferson writes this amazing letter. So in this session, I do want to just jump into religious liberty. Are we prepared to confidently proclaim and live out our faith in a quickly changing culture? The big theme, again, of the weekend is what we believe is both true and good, and we should be confident in engaging in public life. So the way I look at religious freedom is not so much of just helping the church kind of shutter its windows, chain its doors, and protect itself. Like, no, this is a movement of believers. Like, we come here to be equipped, and then we go out during the week to do the work of ministry wherever God has placed us. And so are we confident not just in like religious ministries? Like the 1 square yard behind the pulpit is not the only place that religious freedom should apply, okay? It should apply every day, everywhere, for all believers. And so let's look at kind of where it is, and then we'll look at some scriptural foundations. Why is it something that we should value? And then how can we apply it in our lives? So as we get started, a couple of cultural developments, and there'll be a little bit of complementary coverage between or among the sessions here. But the first one I would say is that we're experiencing the clash of two views of freedom. All right, so what I would say is that we have in the United States kind of an open license view of freedom, which is I get to do me, I get to find myself. And then there is ordered liberty, which is God has created us, and we flourish if we embrace who God's created us to be, both as individuals and as a society. The sexual revolution has shifted from acceptance to enforcement. Have you guys seen this, right? We've been talking about that. It used to be, hey, just recognize the marriage, or just recognize, or this. No, it's no, you have to celebrate this with us, or else. All right, you can lose your job. You can even lose your children. All right, so we have moved from this acceptance phase, just be okay with this other viewpoint, to no, you must join the revolution, or else. And so we see that in these cases we'll talk about. Also, the curious rise of what I would call the religious left. Now, it's more of a resurgence, actually, because you look back into the 60s and 70s, maybe the 50s, there was kind of a religious left that was present. This one kind of caught me by surprise, because when I came out of law school, I got involved in public life. I always assumed there would be people in the secular world that would not agree with Scripture. But I'll give you an example. Actually, a few years ago, there was a bill in front of the Indiana legislature. We're not going to do sex ed in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And sometimes I'm like, why do we have to do the things that we do? But apparently there are these books that are being read in 2nd grade, and so we're just going to say, hey, we're teaching math, all right? That's what we're going to do here. We're going to teach spelling. We're not going to do that. And there were a number of faith leaders that came to the State House, and of course they have kind of rainbow pigments, they have the rainbow scarves, and some of the things they said from the podium just kind of blew my mind. Things like, why are we basing our morality on a 2,000-year-old book riddled with contradictions? Those are fighting words, all right? And I don't fight, but I mean, this was not a policy discussion. This wasn't, well, here's why we think this should be taught to kids. It was God is for teaching 2nd graders about these other ideas. Like literally going back to scriptures, taking the scriptures, and I would say misconstruing them. And so this was something different than I was used to in public life. And these are individuals coming into public life to use Scripture and to actually use their faith to promote things that I believe are unbiblical. So that's a new day. That's something different. And I think you have one of the perfect examples of this, not to just pick on James Tallarico, but I go back to just what do people say. And he says, I believe Christianity points to the truth. I also think other religions of love point to the same truth. I think of different religious traditions as different languages. He also says there's no set Christian orthodoxy concerning the sanctity of life, that we are made in God's image from womb to tomb. We are worthy of the protection of our laws. And he uses the Christian or the faith card to specifically promote ideas that are unbiblical. So that is something that is going, I think, to be more pronounced as we head into coming years. It's not just so much a secular argument. Now, this was interesting. This same hearing, no joke, And this highlights one, we've talked a little bit about don't try to rationalize all this or your head will hurt, all right? But here are these individuals in the chamber saying, God is for this. In the hall, there are people screaming, 2, 4, 6, 8, separate church and state, which is kind of cute. But like these people are yelling this, and these people are saying God is for that. And I'm like, did you guys talk to each other at all? All right, but that's going to be an argument, I think, moving forward. And that is why it's more important. Pastor was talking about definitions and about people, being in the Word. That's why it's more important than ever for us to know the Scriptures and to be willing to say, that's why I encourage pastors, don't even come up and say anything about policy. Just come up and say, this is what the Christian church has believed to be true for more than 20 centuries. Right? This is Christian orthodoxy. So that's one that, again, I kind of got blindsided by it at first. I think it's going to be more pronounced. We've talked about the uncommon return of common sense with some of these cases like John Klug and the Ressler case. And then the last thing I'll say here is that a pen will not save religious freedom. And a number of the things that have been done over the last 2 to 3 years have largely been done via executive order. Well, everyone here is probably civically aware enough to know what happens to an executive order when a new president comes in. All right? It can be completely rewritten. So we need Congress to act on many of these things. And unfortunately, it's just very difficult to get anything passed through Congress right now. So you have the Supreme Court, but just hoping that the Supreme Court continues to rule in favor of religious freedom, that's, again, troubling. We need a comprehensive strategy here. And one of them is we need Congress to step up and to actually create some codification of some of these protections. So a pen will not save it. So many of you, I'm sure, have thought of religious liberty. Again, with the theology of the body, I had never really gone back. Or why do I believe in this? Why do I believe that religious liberty is important? Again, with the rise of the religious left, a lot of times you'll see in a news article, religious freedom is in scare quotes. It's literally putting quotation marks. It's not what it actually purports to be. And people will even say, well, Christians, they just want to be hateful towards their neighbors, and they want this freedom so they can harm other people. You'll probably hear that from others. So why is religious freedom something that's important? Probably not a surprise. You're going to hear this a lot over the next 2 days. That religious liberty is really tied into the fact that we're made in God's image. So here's a definition. If I had to define it, again, Pastor, I'm glad you said that. We actually do some definition work here. The right to believe and live out one's deeply held conviction without fear of coercion or mistreatment by the government. And by the way, there has been a push in years past to you can believe it, but if you can't live out what you believe, kind of what good is it, right? Yes, if you in your own home can believe something, but you can't live it out at your work, you can't speak it in the public, then is it truly religious freedom? And I don't think it is. Also, the Imago Dei, the fact that we are made in God's image, is the foundation of religious liberty. There's a famous chaplain who talked about that this is the right to follow our conscience, the core of every other human dignity, every other human right. All people are made in the image of God. And then Jesus expands on this in his teaching in the New Testament. And I'll go into this in greater detail tomorrow morning. But essentially, we are made in God's image, and salvation, by definition, cannot be coerced. So John 3:16. There's also Acts 17, where Paul, in this very mysterious passage, beautiful passage as he's talking to Mars Hill, he says that, if we happily feel after him, that he's close to all of us, if happily we feel after him. So salvation cannot be coerced. God came, Jesus came, he died for us so that we can have eternal life, but that is something we do voluntarily. It is not something that any government has the actual authority to coerce. Back to the fact that we are substantively different. We have an eternal soul. No tyrant can ever impact your eternal destiny. So not Caesar, not the new technocrats that we're seeing develop. No matter what they do to us, they can never impact our eternal destiny. And that's a beautiful thing. We are so special. We are so unique in God's creation that God, even himself, his way of redeeming mankind was not to force us. into a particular viewpoint, but rather gives us free will. And so what I would say is the Imago Dei, the fact that we're made in God's image, I'll get into this a little bit more tomorrow again, but that is at the core of the church's public witness, because I can be confident if I am promoting the fact that we're made in God's image, I can be confident that it's not just good for me, but that it's good for everyone. So the fact that it is religious liberty for all people, we recognize in all of our neighbors the innate dignity, the fact that they are made in God's image, and that as an image bearer, they cannot be actually coerced into salvation. That this soul liberty, as the founders would call it, and we look back in our long history, Baptists here in the United States were some of the strongest proponents of religious liberty for all people. So we should say, we recognize the equal dignity of everyone else. Government's role is not to coerce the conscience, to try to force people into a particular belief. And by the way, this is a very unique idea in world history. I'll get to this in a second. When Jesus is looking at the denarius, and this is the famous statement. So Jesus says, "Render therefore to Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's." This is revolutionary because he's saying, look, monarchs aren't deity. And every clown with a crown kind of throughout history has said, I'm both king and God, right? So Jesus separates monarchy and deity and says there is a role for government. Government's job, promote good, punish evil. But then there are things that are reserved only to God, which is ultimate allegiance and worship. And government steps out of its role when it attempts to coerce someone to believe something that is against their conscience, against their soul liberty. So this is a beautifully rich biblical principle. And this is one of the principles, I think, that inspired kind of the Protestant Reformation. You look into the American founding. This is something that the founders are also looking at. And you come back to Locke. So Jesus is saying, look, there's kind of two things here. On one hand, like we recognize everyone has a conscience, everyone has a soul, we respect that. But then government's job is to punish evil, promote good, as God defines it. And so Locke has this great note, like, look, if any law is specifically going against God's created order, that's another way of saying the natural law, created order, how God created the world, he made the world, this is the law of nature as God defined it, that law is going to fail because it's not made consistent with how God created us. And one of the ways that he created us was to have a human soul. This was just an example of if we get away from this, of just an individual that does not, he says, we go on to no amount of fear-mongering by describing what goes on to a half-ounce fetus with no consciousness, self-awareness, or feeling of pain is going to change that. So you can see highlighted in public life kind of a Christian viewpoint of from the womb to natural death, this is a person that bears God's image, to this other viewpoint of, like, it's just a blob. It's just a clump of cells. And so the Christian viewpoint in public life is that everyone that we see, whether they have a disability, they have a different ethnicity, a different age, wherever they are in the world, they speak a different language, we're all fellow image bearers. And this is a very distinctive Christian idea that you look back through the annals of history hasn't really been worked out in public life. And we have this really unique moment in the United States to recognize this. So I know that was a little dense, and I know it's Saturday morning too. Thank you for being here to go through these things. But when we step into public life to say we want to promote this, it can come off as kind of Christian favoritism. Like we just want to protect our own interest. But it's not that at all. It is that we recognize the equal dignity of every person. And part of that is their own decision about these ultimate questions are left to God alone. There's a great thinker named Andrew Walker that I've had on the podcast, and he talks about, he's at a Baptist seminary. So certainly, not just as Christians, but as Baptists, this is something we have always promoted. And in fact, we have paid the price for religious liberty down through the ages. So I'm really grateful for that heritage, specifically from the Baptist movement. So where is it? And so I'm going to roll through a couple of things here. I'm going to drop a good bit of information, but don't feel like you have to kind of carry it all. I would say kind of look for maybe one or two things that might apply to you in your space. So where is it? I would say if you think of religious freedom kind of in these series of bubbles, Now, if you look back to 1952, this is very strong. By 2013, like if you're in the marketplace, and if you remember Jack Phillips, he's the cake baker, and he would make all cakes. He just could not in good conscience create all messages. I'm not going to use my God-given creative abilities to create a message that's contrary to what I believe. And he won. But that's where it is kind of being fought. There's also even kind of schools, I use the word school, or independent, non-church Christian ministry. All right, that there are challenges there as well, specifically in like hiring practices, and that there are challenges in this space. Notice what is still very protected in American public life. It's the church. Right? The church has the strongest legal protections available, but if they can get through the marketplace and if they can get through the Christian nonprofit, where do you think they'll head next? All right, to the church. So that's kind of where we are. And then a couple of topics, hopefully will be of interest. So church security, I don't know if any of you remember City's Church in Minneapolis, where the protesters stormed in on a Sunday morning. So that has come up from time to time. I mentioned this briefly before, but churches are private religious property. There is a trespass law in every state, and so if the church does not want someone to be here, you can give them a notice of trespass and make them leave, and then if they don't, then you can call the police and have them come in. There's also a federal statute called the FACE Act, which prevents them from blocking access into religious services. And when you think about our society, I mean, there's so much stress, there's so many problems. Like, we need to be able to come to church on a Sunday morning and fellowship with people that we trust and love and find peace and solace there, not to bring all the politics that we see everywhere, every day, into this space. And so there are strong legal protections. This is actually a friend of mine named Renee, that she's actually representing City's Church. And so they have stood up. And by the way, filming yourself before you go commit a crime and telling people you're going to do it, not super wise. Like, I'm just going to say that, all right? So in that whole situation, they're like filming, hey, we're going to go and invade this church space. And so the federal government has been involved in that. I just wanted to, I imagine most of you know this one already, but just to reemphasize, there are strong protections for church security in the law. The church and politics during election season. And this is a constant question that we get, churches can't say anything. In my own kind of approach, I'm not a huge fan of kind of political punditry from the pulpit necessarily. I leave that up to independent or individual pastors, like what is their conscience. As I mentioned, though, at the beginning, our culture says all these issues, like whether it's abortion or sexual ethics, like these are political issues and the church shouldn't say anything. No, they're biblical issues. The pastor, the church needs to preach the whole counsel of God. And then as pastors feel led to speak out on topics, to encourage folks to vote, all of that is clearly legal. The one challenge that remains in this space is something called the Johnson Amendment. And it says that churches aren't basically to do express advocacy, which would be to say, vote for, vote against, put out an ad saying, hey, vote for this particular person. This has actually been challenged, and there was an agreement between the IRS and the National Religious Broadcasters Association and others that actually this was going to go away, and the church could be free to just say whatever it wants. I still think that is the right constitutional provision or stance. The IRS has no business regulating what a church says, whether it's about politics or anything else. But that is currently being litigated. We had hoped that this lower court ruling would stand, and that would have just clarified everything. But the court just kind of said, I don't have jurisdiction, kind of dodged it. And so now it's up at the Fifth Circuit. So it is a case out of Texas. So you can pray for that. I would love just to see some clarity from the federal government saying, church, hands off. Like, this is not our domain, never was. Amen. So if churches feel led to jump into this and say, vote for, vote against, I think you have constitutional protections. Just know that it is contrary to that provision. It literally is being litigated as we speak. But it's certainly when a pastor is preaching, and maybe sometimes congregations, pastors don't say anything because the congregation's like, Pastor, you shouldn't say anything about politics. Like, no, you're preaching about the sanctity of life or religious freedom or sexual ethics. This provision, the Johnson Amendment, doesn't even cover that. It's not even close. It just says you can't say vote for or vote against. So if we can help educate others as well, especially as we head into election season this fall, that's where that particular issue is. And again, I think the Constitution clarifies that churches have the right, but it's being litigated. One of the biggest ones that is impacting Christian ministries is what's called Christian employment provisions, and the case is called Bostock. Again, it's Saturday morning. I won't go into a ton of weeds, but in 2020, it was actually Justice Gorsuch, who generally considered a conservative on the Supreme Court. The question that came before the court was this. It was a funeral home, one of the cases that was there. It was a funeral home. They had a frontline employee, like a director of the funeral home, left essentially as Steve came back, declared himself to be Amy, and the funeral home said, look, you're representing us, you're representing our values, and that's contrary to who we are, and so we're not going to have you in that position anymore. That is what went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that that funeral home discriminated against that person, using what essentially is this, and Title VII is the employment code. So I know it's Saturday, I'm trying to go quickly here, but Title VII says you can't discriminate based on sex or religion in firing someone from a job. So in 1964, when Congress wrote this, they said you can't discriminate because someone is a man or a woman. That's what sex means, right? You're either a man or a woman. Well, what this case found was essentially that sex actually means sexual orientation and gender identity. Like, Congress meant that in 1964? What? Like, how is that possible? And one of the real challenges is, remember the bubbles, marketplace, independent Christian nonprofit, and then the church, is it's clearly applied to the marketplace, but also it didn't clarify how it impacted ministries. Fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has turned around and said, look, anyone that is teaching the faith, so Jordan, pastor, others that are even in kids ministry, the word is a ministerial person. Now, when I think of minister, I think of a pastor. But in the law, it's anybody that's teaching. So it can be a Christian school teacher, whether they're male or female. As long as they're teaching the faith, ministries have the legal right to hire and fire those individuals based on their statement of faith. Back to the religious liberty piece, like if I went into a mosque as an ordained Christian pastor and said, please hire me, they absolutely have the right to say, no, you're a Christian pastor, we're not going to hire you. Okay, this is freedom of association, this is freedom of religion. But the challenge right now has to do with people that are on staff at ministries that don't teach others. Now, very few, but let's say you're an IT person, or maybe there's somebody that's just making the food in a lunch line at a Christian school. Well, the big push, and you hear some of the arguments about this. I mean, they are pushing this, and one of the big cases right now is Zinsky versus Liberty. So Liberty University, and then Zinsky was an IT professional, was on for I think like 90 days, and then after 90 days, it comes out that this person's living contrary to Liberty University's standard of conduct. And so Liberty University said, well, you can't work for us because you're not upholding our values. And Zinsky sued, and right now there's a case on both sides of the country on this very issue. It's called the Church Autonomy Doctrine. Now, clearly, from the First Amendment, I'll let constitutional scholars out here, should churches be able to hire and fire their staff based on what they believe? Like, absolutely. I mean, how in the world can you speak the truth? How can you model the faith to the next generation if you have people on your staff that don't believe it? Like, it's crazy that this is even an issue, but it's literally being litigated right now. And when you hear the oral arguments, it's like, no, this is just a generally applicable standard, and they have to comply like everyone else, when this is a very serious religious liberty issue. I would hope, and I certainly expect, that the liberty will prevail and that ministries will have the right to hire and fire everyone. But again, these are things we all kind of assume, but I'm just sharing with you, it's not a done deal. Like, this is actually in litigation right now over this issue. So church employment protections. Again, back to pronouns where those here working a secular job, this can impact you. Because the challenge is, all right, if your employer comes to you and says, here's our policy, and often go into some sort of respect, non-bullying, anti-harassment type of policy. You have to use an individual's chosen name and preferred pronouns, or you have to put your pronouns in your email. This is very common. So Christians have landed in a couple different places on this. If it's my own child in my own home, I am going to teach them the Bible. I'm not going to use those. If it's somebody I've met at Starbucks, some Christians would say, I'll use a chosen name, because it's a name like Kristen or Chandler, like that's culturally gendered in a sense. So some Christians would say, I would use a name just so I can have a conversation. Others have said, no, I'm not going to use a name if like the connotation of that name, so Elizabeth, which is more feminine, I'm not going to use that for a male. I'm also not going to use pronouns that are inconsistent with someone's sex, because as we discussed in the first session, like I'm literally giving credence to a falsehood. Right? I am contributing to the falsehood in this situation by calling you she when you're a male. So that's kind of the spectrum of where Christians have landed. And for John Klug, as I had mentioned him before, his approach was just to use a last name. And for those in ministry, like this is, to me, Klug, he's my hero because he's trying to live peaceably with everyone. And so he literally just said, can I use the kid's last name, like a coach? He's literally trying not to make this a controversy. And the school said, okay, that's fine. And then a couple people complained, and so they fired him. And essentially what they're doing in these cases is this school has to give, an employer has to give a religious accommodation unless that accommodation works in undue hardship. And the Supreme Court has clarified that can't be a slight inconvenience. Like it actually has to be an undue hardship. So in this case, what was said is, look, the subjective emotional harm. So if somebody says, I'll use Jordan here. So like Jordan didn't use my preferred pronouns. Now Jordan has offended me, okay? I have now, is there any data showing that I've actually been harmed or I've actually been offended? No. It's just my own subjective emotional harm. So essentially what these courts were finding is that someone's subjective emotional harm is sufficient to get you fired. Like forget the religious accommodation. As long as that person feels like they've been harmed because you didn't go along with this, then you're out. Like that can't be the standard. I mean, for Christians anywhere. And again, try not to scare you today, but that's where a lot of these things have been. I mean, John Klug, he was in litigation from 2017 almost until 26, almost a decade over this simple thing. I just want to have my job, and can I just please refer to these kids using a last name? So fortunately, at least in the Seventh Circuit, in John's case, the court came back. I could almost hug a judge, okay? Because the court very clearly said, like a subjective emotional harm, someone just saying, you have offended me, is not sufficient to override a religious accommodation. It is not an undue hardship. So I'm grateful that at least for that court, they've gotten it straightened out. I expect that will be precedent in other places. So I would just encourage you, if you're here, you're talking to somebody, maybe it's a first job and somebody in the youth group, and they're, oh, my employer's saying that I have to go along with this, and I'm afraid to stand up and say anything. Well, the challenge is if you don't stand up, there's probably other people that are not as strong in the faith that will also just go along with it. So sometimes when you're the one that stands up, you have the steel spine, it encourages others to stand up for what is true. That's the only way, by the way, that I mentioned the uncommon return of common sense. Somebody had to go. Somebody had to stand up and say enough is enough. I think of someone like Riley Gaines. She came and spoke at our dinner, a swimmer at University of Kentucky, and they weren't even told, again, trying to be delicate, they're not even told that this male is going to be in their locker room, in their private spaces, and he just comes in and undresses like right in front of them. Someone, what a courageous young woman to stand up and say to everyone in the leadership at the NCAA, no, that's not right. So sometimes someone has to go first. I just want to encourage you, though, in this space, there are a number of law firms, legal groups that would, it's kind of like ambulance chasers. Do you guys, the billboards around San Antonio? It's not exactly the same in the religious liberty space, but if you are, I'll say this, if you are being reasonable in living out your faith and just want to stand up and say, I can't go against my conscience, there would be people lined up to help you. And again, don't be unreasonable. But in this, if you're just saying, I can't in good conscience say something that is untrue, I believe there would be people line up, including us, that would say, hey, we would like to assist you. Another one that, again, is, I think, close to home, school counselors. This is Kathy McCord, also a client. She just confirmed publicly that there was a plan in place at a local school that if a kid went to the school, declared themselves to be transgender, and then said to the school, don't tell my parents, that the school would hide this from the parents. Like, this is crazy to me. This is the most important person in a kid's life, and we're going to cut them out of the equation. The school just settled with her. And then Charles V. Salazar, this was a Christian counselor that when a young person comes to them, they need to have the right to be able to say, here's what God says about this. And Colorado had essentially a law that said that if a kid comes to you, the only thing you can do is affirm their ideology. You can't say what the Bible says as a condition of being licensed. And so she won her case. The Supreme Court very clearly said, look, you've got to give room for difference of opinions on this. So another big takeaway from this session is religious liberty, free speech has been on a roll the last couple of years. I'm super grateful for it. Doesn't mean we get to let our guard down, but we are seeing some important wins in protecting Christians. Parental rights, I've dug into this a little bit. I mentioned Mary and Jeremy Cox, but another one of these parental rights. Parental rights, it's said in our jurisprudence, it's the oldest and most fundamental of the liberty interests that we have. This is one that we don't talk a lot about in seminars like this or in presentations like this. But again, God kind of threw me right into the middle of this, and I think it's one of the greatest challenges facing Christians today. And it's so much worse, because as I mentioned, like, you can take my job, but if you come after my kids, I mean, what good is the freedom of speech if I can't use that speech to raise my own children? Or the freedom of religion if I can't raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? So this is a devious thing. And because of the drug crisis, because of abuse and neglect, because of the breakdown of the family, parental rights keeps getting deprioritized in our culture. And so we're having to raise it back up. So one of the cases recently was that literally for kids in elementary school, they're reading these books that are promoting gender ideology, things that are unbiblical. And the religious parents objected to it, but the school would not let them opt their kids out of this instruction. Finally, it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court says, no, religious parents, you have the right to opt your kids out of that instruction. So again, that's a strengthening case. There's also a recent case, Mirabelli versus Bonta, where the Supreme Court, for the first time literally in a quarter century, just reaffirmed this. There's also a very important case I would encourage you to pray about that's coming out of Washington State. We mentioned this case in our petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, or we mentioned this law. And essentially what can happen in Washington State is if a child declares himself to be transgender, runs away from the parents to a shelter, that shelter can literally hide that child from the parents if the child does not want the parents to know. So literally, I mean, you can imagine, it just runs away. The state takes emergency custody of that kid, completely cuts the parents out. Like, how in the world, how can you square that with the fact that the right to raise your child is a fundamental liberty interest? Like, this is completely wrong. So the Supreme Court has actually agreed to take that case. This is so important because, again, the whole idea of if raising your children consistent with their being made as a boy or a girl, if the state treats that as if it's abuse or neglect, there is going to be a world of challenge for Christian parents all across the United States. I can't say a lot about it, but there's also about to be introduced in Congress, we have sponsors at least, a law that would say across the country parents would be protected by this. So we're working on it, but that's the one that certainly concerns me as when I wake up in the morning of the big challenges facing Christians, not one that I would have foreseen even 5 years ago, but one that's certainly affecting us. So what's next? I mentioned Sage Blair, Mary and Jeremy. By the way, just so you can know, sometimes trying to tell Christians, like, what are we up against? This is the exact language. Like, this is the transcript from the case that I handled. This is the Department of Child Services arguing about this Christian home. We just feel at this point in time this child needs to be in a home that's not going to teach her that everything about transgender, tell her how she should think and how she should feel, Pastor. However, she should be in a home where she is accepted for who she is. That was the argument they made in court about this Christian family. So in Indiana, we turned around and became the first state in the country to pass a law that just says parents raising their kids consistent with their faith is not abuse or neglect. Again, it's one of these, like, we really have to pass this? But there are other states that are picking it up as well. So what's next for religious freedom? That's a kind of a foster care piece. This, of course, works into if you're a foster parent, can you be kicked out over your beliefs as well? But when I think of what's next, we look at kind of a big strategy of we certainly want to engage the church, partner with government in impacting the family, encouraging folks. Certainly elections matter, and also creating public policy, laws matter, and then defending things in court also matter. So we take a comprehensive approach to it. Now, I realize at the end of something like this, that was a lot of information. My hope was to just give you kind of currently where we are. But then looking at this massive strategy, it's like, well, what do I do? And so I always end this particular presentation with this line, is the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. All right, so the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. Please, as a fellow believer, don't in your mind delegate the defense of your family, of religious freedom, to lawyers and to advocates in the public square. Like, yeah, but I got to get the kids to school on Monday, and I got my job, and I have. So I'm not encouraging you maybe to think about a career change or anything, but as you are living out your faith in your job, it may come to you. Like, you may not go looking for this controversy, like John Klug, like Mary and Jeremy Clocks, my clients. This controversy found them, and it was their Esther moment, in a sense. Like, for such a time as this, like, I've been put there. But even the quiet of just raising our children consistent with biblical values, modeling the faith to them, impacting our neighbors, having a church that's engaged in the community. I know the community center that you guys are working on, and just showing up in public life and saying, we're not going to be quiet. We're going to bring our ideas forward. That is the groundswell that around the country defends religious freedom for the next generation. So it may be like a specific call to impact elections or to create public policy, if there's something there. Maybe you'll become a plaintiff in a court, but primarily it's encouraging, being a strong part of this church, and a church that then engages the community. Then, my strategy or part of this is we have been working with the Department of Child Services. So I'll give you kind of my example of this. So 2.5 years ago, we sued the Department of Child Services. We are now touring with them. All right, we identified 10 of the hardest hit counties. I'll talk more about this in the morning with the Joseph moment, because the state said we need help with foster care. And so we're now touring with DCS. I had a chance to speak to a number of their leaders as well. And we do this so that when the next controversy comes, they know we're not just the people that are kind of sitting on the sidelines. Like, no, we're engaged in this too, and we're partners with you. And so when people, kick and scream about, oh, religion, it's hateful, it's not bringing a result. Like, no, these are the people in the trenches serving the families and children with us. Why would we cut them out of the equation? And so if we use our religious freedom, that is the best way to protect it. And so not so much how do you have to run for office or win a Supreme Court case. It's in your particular sphere of influence, in your own zip code, how can you best promote Christian principles, not just in the church, but also to the community. I think that's the best way moving forward. All right, so we've gone through religious liberty. I'll pause there, have a couple minutes for questions, and we'll let everybody go. But yeah.
I would just like to, it's not really a question so much, but the best way to defend religious freedom is to use it. And I've met many Christians who will say, well, what can I really do? And, I'm not in that situation to be a plaintiff or whatever. And I literally could take hours and explain to them what they could do. You develop relationships as you well know, of elected leaders. We were involved in 4-H. We invited politicians to the 4-H fairs and give them opportunity to shake hands with them and got to know them. Ones that we could support, we campaigned for, we developed those relationships. We went to the State House when I lived in Indiana, spent time, called them out of session that we were out there, wanted to talk to them, and they came out because they knew who we were, and we told them why we were there, and you have input, and we actually saw changes through developing these relationships. And you exercise your religious liberty, your right to redress government. You support people you can support, and you stand with them, like you said. Sometimes you find yourself standing with people that don't even share your beliefs, like we would think about traditionally, but maybe they're on the other side over here, but you're in agreement in this area, so you can work with those people. You financially support these organizations like in Indiana, IFI and AFA of Indiana and others that are going to the State House and representing the Christian worldview and lobbying. You go and lobby yourself. You teach your children how laws are passed. There are just so many opportunities to exercise your religious freedom, and we better exercise it now while we still can if we want to secure it for the future. And I know that was more of a preaching than a question.
And we have a connection back to Southeast Indiana, which is crazy. So it's amazing. The one thing I'll double click on, because there's so much that we can do, what you mentioned about praying for and building a relationship with your governing officials. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. That I think is at the core of it. You can go online and just look up who are my elected officials. There's a database in Texas. You'll be super surprised writing a handwritten note to them. We'll meet in Indiana. We have cubicles, all right? We pride ourselves on being frugal, so they have cubicles. I'll see a stack of correspondence, and then I'll see one thank you note, like pinned to the wall over here. And so seeing that less, and maybe one of the big ideas today is like seeing that less as something novel or dirty and just as an extension of ministry in the community. These are people that God has appointed as ministers for our good, and they're actually much more accessible than you think. Even praying for them, sending them a note, if you have an opportunity to meet with them, ministering to them as a person. Because if you do that, when you get to the controversy, it's just a different ball game. So thank you for that encouragement. And that might be the one I would just double click on. Even if you're like, I don't ever watch politics, I don't want to do anything. But we're all still, if you're a citizen of the United States, you're a vested part of this thing. And that's been a beautiful way. We've made about 5,000 connections at the Indiana State House, and it's just changed the name of the game. So thank you for that. Any other questions about where we are, what to do next?
A thought that comes to mind too is just the fact that we as believers can actively pray that the Lord would put Josephs and Daniels and Esthers into positions of influence and that they would be effective in their sphere of influence. Whether we're called to a government position or not, each of us has a calling the Lord has placed us in, but that he would put those people there, and when he does place them there, that they would be effective in promoting truth and righteousness, and that they would stand with integrity would be key. And then we can have influence promoting and teaching God's truth in our circle while praying that God would put people into other circles as well. And we can see that take place, and that's encouraging to see.
Absolutely. I love the story of Nathan and David, because there is the praying for, thank you for what you do, but even for fellow believers that end up in public life, there are moments where, like anyone, it's like, hey, you have some egg on your face. Like you shouldn't have made that vote, or you're letting power go to your head. You're acting more like someone that's just committed to power rather than doing this as a fellow believer, pursuing the common good. Nathan didn't do that on social media, right? What did he do? He looked him right in the face. There's a relationship there. You're the man. And if we could all, and even if one of our visions is like every pastor in a state, part of a broader coalition across the country, like if every Bible preaching pastor in a state had that type of personal relationship with their governing officials, how could the United States change? through the power, and that's first. It's very simple. It's 1 Timothy 2. Pray for those in authority. Build a relationship with them. So thank you for that. Yeah, we need that as well. Well, I'm happy to stay around. Yes, Pastor.
Nobody else has a question. I just I'm wondering from you if correct me if I'm seeing some things wrongly, but I have some concerns about just our government and how it has changed over the years. And you mentioned that we're seeing like a 2-year run. I think you said 2 years of things are going very well for religious liberty, and I'm grateful for that. But my concern is that that can change on a dime, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that people don't even understand our government and how it works anymore. I remember recently a sheriff being asked, "What branch of government do you fall under?" He didn't even know what the branches were, let alone which branch of government he was under, and it became a national story. I don't think it was asked by a national correspondent, but it became a national story because he didn't even know what any of that means. Additionally, even especially at the federal level, and not so much at the state, but at the federal level, and this is where the problem comes because we have the Supreme Court. But at the federal level, at least from my observation, correct me where I need correction, but at least at the federal level, the legislative branch, which was supposed to be the major branch of the three, has ceded its authority to the executive branch through bureaucracies. These bureaucracies are making the laws more than our legislators are, and they're the ones that are supposed to be tasked with that. Then additionally, they're handing it off to the courts because they don't push back on any court decisions, but with new laws or better defining those laws. They throw up their hands and say the court has spoken. And now that we have more of a conservative Supreme Court, that can change in a moment, especially going the idea that's being floated now, going back to FDR about packing the court, and that's what everyone liberal wants to do now. And if that happens, then these things that are happening in the state house and happening in the local government that is more friendly to the idea of religious liberty, that can be changed when it's challenged at the Supreme Court. And now the Supreme Court, if it's been packed, can just dictate these things. And these are things that concern me. And I don't know if you see them the same way, or maybe you can correct my concerns, but these are all problematic, and we need to teach our people, we need to teach our children how the government is supposed to operate, because it's not operating the way it was created to operate.
No, absolutely. I think the founders would be most surprised, if Hamilton or Madison showed back up today, and you're like, Congress is doing what? Because they were so concerned. There's so little talked about in the judiciary because they didn't have the power to control the military or veto. They had very little concern for the judiciary. They were much more concerned about controlling the legislature and the president. So, Congress, do your job. Is constant thing.
They just want FaceTime. They want to be. They want to get their meme out there and become popular and get their own podcast.
So it's almost like, how much time do we have on this? It's one reason why I will mention our governor. I know you have a great governor here in Texas, and we, by the way, we minister to the office. Scripture commands us to pray for all that are in authority. When Paul wrote that, Nero's on the throne, he killed Christians, his opponents, and his own mom. And Paul's like, pray for that guy. All right, so we see those in office as ministers of God for our good. But one of the reasons I'm grateful for our governor, he was our U.S. Senator. And he specifically chose to come back to Indiana to lead the state because he was so frustrated by the deadlock in Congress that he thought he could do more good creating a model state than he could there. Now, we need good people in both. So you've also kind of hit at the heart of what we're trying to do across the country. We're called to follow Jesus in every area, but we found that there was a hole in kind of discipleship materials for citizenship. And part of it, the local church has to disciple in every area, whether it's finances, marriage, and all of this. And so we're trying to help with that, just as an assist to the local church. But providing, first, what does Scripture say? But then, yes, what does our form of government say? So I wish I could, like magic wand, get civics back into all the schools. But I think you're absolutely right, and why it is concerning. People always say, like, this next election is the most important election of our lifetime. It's like, but I thought the last one was the most important. But it is an important election in our lifetime, okay? So is the way I frame it, because there are these things that are lingering, and a lot to think and pray about. And so I'm just grateful that you're here today. Thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to be here. We'd love to connect with you. We do have some resources. I'll get more into that tomorrow with Bible studies on kind of all the topics that we've gone through. But I just greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll pass it back to you, Pastor. So.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. And any other comments or questions real quick before we close down? Anything at all? Yes, sir.
We are going to fellowship and eat and hang out together.
Yeah.
I want to make sure of that.
Yeah. So anyone who'd like to stay and fellowship and get some more individual time, yes, sir.
Is there anything we can do to support you and your organization? If maybe we wanted to help somebody that's already plugged in, how could we do that?
This is certainly prayer. I would come back to this. It definitely is a spiritual battle. Just equipping the local church, so some of the resources out there, we've taken a lot of time to kind of walk through them, and so kind of everyone's on the same page. What I will mention, in a connection that I can make, is I have good friends that are at the Texas State House, that they invite pastors up to kind of come and pray as they're trying to impact the state of Texas. So I try to get folks plugged into that. We do have, people we're representing around the country, and so if it's something God might lay on your heart to equip us there. But the big thing I want to encourage folks with is you're going to have your greatest impact in your own zip code. So, take this information and go use it, impact your zip code. That's what we're trying to do. So.
All right. If nothing else, then Jordan, why don't you stand and pray for us?
I want to thank you that our citizenship is in heaven. And